In this video, we will talk some more about the ls command. We've talked before about ls, and we've been using it a bit throughout the course, but now it's time to dive into a few more useful options that we haven't talked about. The first thing we're going to talk about is the -l option, ls-l for a long format. It tells us a lot more information about files. As you can see, if I just do this in my home directory, there's a lot of information about all the files and directories that are there. So let's walk through that format just a little bit. The very first character on the far left-hand side tells us what kind of a file or a thing we're looking at. You notice that in my case, it's all either a D or a hyphen. The hyphen is for a regular file. A regular file in Linux can be anything, pretty much anything that's contained in a single file. So it could be a text file, it could be a compiled program, it could be a video, anything in a single file. Directory, like the very first line, ch3, a directory is indicated by a D. Symbolic link, it would be indicated with an L in the first column. And there's a few other types that can show up there. Generally, they're not things that you're likely to come across in day-to-day use, so we're not going to worry about them here, but just be aware that there could be other things. Mostly what you're going to see are the hyphens and Ds and maybe the occasional L. The rest of that first field shows the permissions of the file or the directory. And that's a complex enough topic that we're going to address that in a completely separate video. So for now, just know that it's there. Those are the permissions, the RWX stuff. The next field is the link count. In the case of files, it tells us how many links there are to that file. In the case of directories, it tells us how many directories are in that directory. Files aren't counted, but other directories are counted. Now, if you look down through this list at all the directories, you'll see that all of the directories are at least 2. What is up with that? If I look in, for example, public, there's nothing in there, but it says there's 2 things. Remember, every directory has 2 directories in it, 2 special directories. They are dot and dot dot. Dot is the directory itself, dot dot is the directory one level up. And those are counted as 2 directories within that directory. The next column is the file owner. Every file or directory is owned by a user on the system. In this case, it's my home directory. It's kind of uninteresting. All the files are owned by me. Not too surprising. The next column is the group. I know it looks just like my username again, but that's the group. Every file or directory, again, is associated with a group of users. And by default on Linux these days, every user gets their own group. It could be something different, and there are cases where you use something different, but like for my home directory, it's in the group Jeff, which has one person in it, which is Jeff. The next column is the file size in bytes. For a file, that's really easy. The killme.sh is 174 bytes. Very easy to figure out. For directories, there's actually a file that defines a directory, and it's allocated in chunks. And the size you see for a directory is the size of that file that defines the directory and its contents. I think in every single case of my directories, they are 4096. Turns out those files are allocated in chunks, and the chunk size that's being used on my system happens to be 4 kilobytes. It allocates a 4 kilobyte chunk for directory, and then if it needs to expand beyond that, it'll go to 8 kilobytes, etc. So a very big directory could be much larger, but the 4K is fine. The next column you see is the modification time of the file. If it's recent, the modification time is shown like you see here as a month and a day and a time. If it's an old file, what you'll see there is the month, the day, and the year for something that's very old. And finally, we have the name of the file or directory. In the case of a soft link, we would also see where the link points to. And you'll notice my output happens to be colored. That's a special feature that you may or may not see. So if it's executable, it's green. If it's a regular file, it's white. And if it's a directory, it's blue. There's some other colors that can be in there to help you visually distinguish the things in your directory. Sometimes we have big files. We're going to take a look at a directory called /boot. And the main thing that we want to look at in there, this is where Linux itself is. The thing that starts up when you start Linux is contained in this directory. And you can see there's some big files. I don't know about you, but when I look at, for instance, the initrd, and I see a number of 289.67705, I have no idea how big that is. That number is kind of meaningless to me. It's so big that it doesn't mean anything. And it's not delineated in any way. I actually have to count from the right. So it's 28,967,705. It even takes me a minute to figure that out. Well, there is a nice option to ls. If we add an H, H is for human, and it says, give me sizes in a human-friendly format. That file's 28 megabytes. The config is 162K, 3.3 megabytes, 5.6 megabytes. Those are numbers that are far more meaningful to me. So that's a very handy option. The next option we're going to look at is a -R. And the R is for recursive. And this provides a recursive listing. Very simply, it lists the directory and then it traverses everything below that directory. So if I just say, again, back to my home directory, ls-r, I see everything in my home directory, and then it goes to all the subdirectories and the subdirectories of the subdirectories and that kind of thing. We can combine that with -L, and we can get the same thing in a long format. And those ones with question marks are because I don't have permission to see that. So we'll go up here to where there's something a little more interesting going on. So you can see I get a long format listing of everything recursively under my home directory. So what if we want to see the listing for a directory? So for instance, my home directory. Now I could say ls-l. If I say home Jeff, I'm going to see the contents of my directory. If I say home, then I can see that Jeff is one of the things in there. But there's another option I can do, and I can say ls-ld. And if we remember that tilde is a synonym for my home directory, the D says, show me the listing of the directory itself. It's the same information as when I looked in /home, except I have specifically said I want to look at that directory. So we could do the same thing, ls-ld /boot, and we can see what the permissions are on the /boot directory. D works with or without the long option. It's a little less interesting without the long option because you're just looking at it. But again, if I wanted to see that directory as opposed to the contents of the directory, I add -D. There are a lot of options to ls. If we look at the man page, they don't even bother to list them in the synopsis. There are a ton of options. And there are a lot of other things you can do with ls. But at this point, we have covered the most commonly used options. And if you stick with the ones we've had here, that's going to be 95, 98% of all the use you'll ever need to make of the ls command. And with that, we conclude our discussion of ls.